India has two very different worlds within itself, the North and the South. A few years ago, this tourist decided to document his experience across both regions, and this is what he had to say.
I find the southern states to be safer, more orderly, and more relaxed, whereas the north has more chaotic streets with so many honking horns and cows blocking the road.
If you too have traveled within India, you know that the South is vastly different from the North. The people are civilized, kind, they aren't spitting pan masala everywhere. It's like the polar opposite of the way Instagram and Twitter describe India. But this stark disparity is not a good thing. There's so much more behind it than meets the eye, and there's even more challenges when it comes to fixing this disparity. Let's understand what all of these things are, as always, with the help of data and evidence. Let's get started. Look at the northern state of Bihar, for instance, one of India's poorest states. So poor that people steal ponds and bridges here. The literacy rate is just 61% compared to the national average of 74%. The life expectancy of a person residing here is just 69 years, 3 years short of the national average. The numbers are similar for its neighboring states as well, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan and Jharkhand. On the other hand, down south we have Karnataka, one of the most prosperous and livable states in India, home to countless startups and rapid growth. Both the literacy rate and the life expectancy is higher for Karnataka than the national average, and you can see the same for its neighboring southern states. And the effects of this can be seen in the data. The 5 southern states contribute twice as much to India's GDP compared to the northern states, despite having 200 million fewer people. And all of this has led to a narrative that the South is better than the North. But weirdly, people don't realize that these are all symptoms of an underlying condition, one that had to do with how India was governed after independence. So there's all this disparity, and the southern states are clearly more developed than their northern counterparts, and as a result they don't receive as much government funding to develop themselves. For example, in 2022, for every 100 rupees that the state of Karnataka contributed to the central government, they received 13.9 rupees back for their own development. On the other hand, for every 100 rupees that Bihar contributed to the central government, they received a whopping 922 rupees. Now this makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Bihar isn't doing well, so it requires more government support. Karnataka is doing well, so it doesn't need as much government support. But here's the thing, the southern states aren't happy with this distribution at all. They say that despite being offered so much aid, the northern states continue to struggle with poverty and corruption. The stolen bridge, the ponds, the railway tracks, all those thefts happened right now after 2022. So the southern states feel like instead of being rewarded for their development, they are being penalized. And that is completely valid. Hear me out for a second. Let's say you and your brother go to work at the same place. You have a salary of 10,000 rupees, whereas your brother has a salary of just 2,000 rupees. At the end of the month, your parents take 4,000 rupees from your paycheck and give it to your brother so that you both are on the same playing field. Now, in theory, this makes perfect sense. Your parents are doing this only as a temporary measure till your brother also starts earning 10,000 rupees. But what happens in reality is that he is incentivized to not work hard. Your brother is happy because he's receiving 40% of your salary without having to do anything, and you start feeling like, what's the point of me working hard if my brother is going to take 40% of my pay anyway? This is what's bothering the southern states right now. They believe that the north isn't being incentivized to improve. We'll break down this incentive part in a bit, but first let's talk about how it got so bad. But before we do that, if you learned something new up until this point, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's free for you, but it keeps us incredibly motivated. For starters, given India's geography, the southern states were closer to ports, which gave them better access to trading avenues. On the other hand, the northern states like Uttar Pradesh, Jharkhand and Bihar had plenty of natural resources. As a result, all the factories and industries set up shop there. But the government of India wanted factories to be set up all across the country so that development isn't concentrated in one region. So they came up with something called the Freight Equalization Policy of 1952. Now a manufacturer could set up a factory wherever they liked, and the cost of shipping all the natural resources from the northern states to these factories would be borne by the government in the form of a subsidy. Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? But it backfired horribly because the industrialists chose to expand only in the southern states that were closer to the ports because the government was paying for the shipping cost of these natural resources anyway. The northern states were simply reduced reduced to a reserve of natural resources with hardly any economic activity. This went on for almost 4 decades, and by the end of that, the damage was done. Due to higher economic activity, the southern states acquired wealth and were easily able to move past literacy onto things like upskilling and education, while the northern states lagged behind. You remember I told you everything is a symptom? Today, South Indians love to bash North Indians, particularly with respect to their endless gutka and pan masala consumption that leads to all these red stains around us. But these same North Indians fail to realize that this is also a function of incomes. The northern states consume so much of smokeless tobacco because that's all they can afford for 1 to 5 rupees. The Global Adult Tobacco Survey gathered data which proved this. Some of the poorest states in India, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar and Jharkhand, saw nearly 1/3 of their population consume this form of smokeless tobacco. On the other hand, the people in the southern states didn't consume it as much, not because they were morally superior, but because they had higher incomes. People there don't use pan masala because they can afford alcohol. The 5 southern states consume more than 50% of the entire nation's alcohol. So, we've established that the north is in a severely terrible condition and it needs the south's help. But despite that, southern politicians aren't willing to help their northern counterparts. Why is that? It's not because these southern politicians are evil. Although they might be for different reasons, they're mad about helping the north because of the way in which the help is being offered. More specifically, they believe that the north is being incentivized to not improve. I'm not making this up at all. Let's go back in time and you'll see exactly what I mean. You see, the Indian government decides which state gets how much money based on several factors like their income, population, how much tax they're collecting, their forest effort, their area. Each factor is allocated a certain weightage, but the largest weightage goes to income and population. So the poorer and larger a state is, the more funds they would get from the central government. As a result, a state government might be incentivized to keep its own population poor and large in size in order to attract more funds from the central government. Now, it gets worse. Focus on population for a second. Back in 1976, India was desperately trying to control its own population. The government implemented several measures and started pushing the states to curb their own population, but the states on the other hand were worried that if we control our own population, tomorrow the government may not give us adequate funds for our own development. So to reassure these states, the government enacted an amendment. This made sure that the 1971 census data would be used when it came to enacting any policy to distribute funds to various states of India. In the 1971 census, southern India made up 38% of India's population, whereas in 2011 they made up only 32% of India's population due to successful population control measures. However, in 2017, when the government sat down to plan how much money is to be allocated to the various states of India, instead of using the 1971 census data, they used the 2011 data, where southern states' share had dropped by almost 6%. So naturally they felt like despite doing good things like controlling our population, increasing our life expectancy, increasing our literacy, we are being penalized when the north gets more and more funds every single year. And this population issue gets even worse because it directly impacts the elections. The year 2026 is the deadline for what's called delimitation. So the government uses the old 1971 census data for two things. First, to decide which state gets how much money. And second is to determine the total number of members of parliament that each state can elect. Under the old 1971 census, where the southern states made up 38% of the Indian population, currently they are able to elect 129 members of parliament. Meanwhile, just two northern states, Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, can elect approximately the same number of members of parliament, 120. If you include the other northern states as well, this number goes beyond 190. And after the delimitation, the states with higher populations, the northern states, would have even more representation in the parliament, which would lead to a situation where the national election would be decided by a handful of northern states, leaving the south with less say despite contributing more economically. Think of it from the perspective of a taxpayer. You are paying all of this tax for the development of another state, and despite doing this duty, you aren't getting adequate representation in the parliament. How's that fair to you? This roadblock can be solved with a few solutions. The first is to reward good behavior, meaning the weightages for collecting tax and controlling your population need to be increased when it comes to allocating budgets. Meaning the 15th Finance Commission did did reward the southern states for doing all these things, but this was negligible. This reward needs to be increased so that the southern states would also be incentivized to keep doing what they are doing best. Second is to make sure that all the money being spent in the northern states is actually being used for the development and not to fill some politicians' pockets. This can be done by something called implementation-based funding. Let's say the central government introduces a $10 billion package for a northern state. It doesn't release all the funds together, but in installments, that too contingent on meeting some existing performance goal. The third is to allocate a performance-based bonus for all the states. If any state is able to meet superior numbers when it comes to life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, then that state needs to be rewarded so that it can be incentivized to keep doing this. How do you think this problem can be solved? Let me know in the comments. And if you stuck around up until this point and learned something of value, consider subscribing to the channel, as that's what keeps us incredibly motivated.